Hi, my name is Amy Peeler. I'm Associate Professor of New Testament at Wheaton College and Graduate School.
Dr. Amy Peeler. Amy, good to see you. Welcome to Exegetically Speaking.
Always glad to be here with you, David.
This is fun. You've been on a lot of times, and we thank you for your help and support for this.
Well, I am a firm believer in the good of the languages. There is no exchange for knowing the original text.
That's exactly right. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about Matthew 1, verse 20, I think it is. But before that, I want to mention your new book called Women and the Gender of God, a fabulous book. We did another podcast on it with the one we do here at the Linear Library called The Stone Chapel. I don't think it's aired yet, but it will pretty soon.
Exciting, exciting.
If you were to sum it up in 30 seconds, what would you say about the book?
That this book focuses on the incarnation, particularly the role of Mary. And when we read Matthew and Luke closely, we discover that God values women and that God is not preferentially male or masculine. So that's the sound bite.
That's the
I hope
sound
that's
bite.
Intriguing enough for people to pick it up.
All right. I hope they do as well. It's a great book. It's an important book, particularly these days when there's all sorts of discussions about gender and gender issues, right?
Right.
All right. So today we're going to talk about Matthew chapter 1, verse 20. Now, I want to read it in the New Revised Standard Version. It's an interesting translation. It's not an uncommon translation. And I'll give a few other examples from other translations because I have a particular question I want to bring to you, particularly about Mary and here what's called the virgin birth, right? So here it is in the New Revised Standard Version. But just when Joseph, had resolved to do this, that is, to put Mary away quietly and to divorce her, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit."
Mm-hmm.
All right. So here's my question to you about this text, and it focuses in upon the word conceived. Mm-hmm. Now, when I look at other translations, they also say, now this happens to be an aorist participle,
right.
Taganathan, and it means, it can mean is conceived, but it is conceived in English Standard Version, is conceived in the King James Version, was conceived in the New Living Translation, is conceived in the New International Version. And when I looked at the message, it gave us really interesting. It said spirit conceived,
Fascinating.
which is fascinating.
Bringing a little bit of Luke in there
Bringing
for
in
us.
a little bit of that in. Exactly. So here's my question to you. When modern people come and read this particular text, I'm afraid we might be importing into that text some of our ideas about what conception involves.
Of course.
So as you read that, and now having worked with it in your book, help us understand that, because in our modern idea of conception, our conception of conception,
exactly,
in our conception of conception, the male brings the sperm and the woman contributes the egg. Each has 23 pairs of chromosomes and such. So we have all of this stuff built in, which is good information, but the ancients didn't know that.
Right.
Matthew didn't know that. Matthew's audience wouldn't have known that. So how do we best sort of think about that?
Yes. Oh, such a rich set of questions there. So it is true that we are privy to many more specifics than the ancients would have been. And yet they had figured out that it takes both a male and a female to create a child. They knew that much.
They knew that much, right? Okay.
They did. And so I think you're naming some of the questions that come from a modern standpoint. A present one is, conception is a sexual act. Is that what the text is saying happened to Mary? But interestingly, these are the same questions that Matthew's original hearers would have had, but just with a slightly set of different understandings of conception and birth. But no matter what level of detail you have, this is risky. This is a thing that has never happened before. Now, Matthew's readers probably would have been aware that there were stories of the gods impregnating women. And to me, that's even more striking that Matthew chose, yeah, this story is worth telling, and I'm going to take the risk of that association, but demonstrate that this is not sexualized in the way that you've known every other conception to happen. And
Mm.
actually, canonically, I think it's really important that we read Matthew and Luke together because Matthew blessedly gives us Joseph's perspective, right? Hey, this has happened. This is a reality. Here's how you need to respond. And
Mm.
it's Luke that gives us more insight with the scene of the Annunciation. So that is really important to put together.
Mm.
I'd like to avoid two kind of ends of the spectrum here.
Okay.
So I definitely think the New Testament authors are emphasizing that this is not a sexual encounter between God and Mary, that God remains God and does this amazing act of entering creation as a human all the way from conception to death,
Mm.
but does not violate or oppress Mary's will or body. And
Mm.
I recognize that I need to give more exegetical support for that. And I would, if people are interested, direct them to my book where I endeavor to do so.
Good, good.
But I want to avoid another end of the spectrum as well. Sometimes I think a Christian response has been absolutely, God is not sexual. And so maybe this is a totally spiritual kind of conception in the sense that Mary really has nothing to do with it, but God just kind of zooms the embryo of Jesus into her body.
Like she's a
And
surrogate
interesting.
woman, right? Surrogate.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, that's perfect language, right? That she
Hmm.
serves as a surrogate. And Christian history also absolutely denies that if he's going to be human, he must actually possess humanity, and he gets that from her. Now, admittedly, because we understand DNA, we're left with some questions.
Lots of
And I think
questions. Yeah.
exactly. And those are good questions to ask. I know someone just reminded me of Edward Cassell, has kind of I think it was from 1983 in a science journal, Parthenogenesis, and looks at the science of that. Oliver Crisp, from a theology standpoint, and several different essays in his works have said, hey, what could we know about Jesus's DNA? I think where we ultimately have to land is both that God uses, by virtue of her willing acceptance,
Mm.
God uses the flesh of Mary to become incarnate. And yet, still, there's a mystery there that we maybe never fully can understand. God has to supply something because she couldn't supply everything necessary for Jesus. So I
Mm.
love my Orthodox friends who will say, there are mysteries and we
Yeah.
have to accept some mystery. But I hope I'm articulating well, absolutely not sexualized, but also not, quote, spiritual to the degree that she's uninvolved.
Right.
And that sweet middle space, I think, is what Matthew is meaning by conception.
Hmm. So, is there a better word than that? I mean, I know
Mm,
translations are limited, and that's why we need good commentaries. That's why we need books
right.
like yours, "Women and the Gender of God." But is there a better way of phrasing it?
Wow. No, that's a wonderful question. I have not discovered a word that I'm like, oh, I wish translations would use this instead.
Hmm.
It does seem to be one of those instances where a faithful translation isn't the end point, but the beginning point,
Mm.
for then
That's a great
groups of
word.
Christians to come around and press into the deeper meaning of what that is. Because I think I might be, if there could be a word that would still affirm that Jesus goes through the process that all humans have gone through,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Um, that I would be okay with using it. But anything that would set him into a category that would call into question his full humanity, I would want to step away from. So
Yeah.
it's this tense thing of like honoring that this is unparalleled and never repeated, never in Israel's past, never will it be in the future that God becomes incarnate. And yet it is truly a human incarnation. That's a
Exactly.
how do you get that through in one word? I want to keep reflecting on that, but I certainly
Yeah,
don't have
yeah.
the
As
answer
soon as you
ready.
know that, let me know because I would like to. I'd like to think about that. You know, it's interesting to me that early Christians like Paul began to
Mm,
think of Jesus in terms of new Adam.
Yes.
as the new Adam
Yes.
sort of language, and began
Yes.
reflecting upon him. And I think it probably has nothing to do with the conception, the virgin birth, that kind of thing. It's very fascinating. And in Luke's version, he takes the genealogy of Jesus back
Right.
to Adam, right?
Yes.
And things begin there. It seems like.
Yes.
But this is really interesting. I've always wondered about that, and I'm curious if there's anybody out there who might have an idea, who's listening, who might have an idea about how we
That would
could do
be
that. I'd love to hear
wonderful.
from you at that point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. The other thing that strikes me about Matthew's use of that word, if readers go up above into the genealogy itself, that's the term that he uses, and I think it's 41 times. I didn't recount this morning, but I counted in the past of naming all of the ancestors of Jesus, so and so. Usually it's translated as begot so and so,
Yeah.
but it is the same word, ganao. And in all of those instances, that is an aorist active indicative. And then when you get to the mention of Joseph in verse 16, and Jacob bore Joseph, then you have a shift. Who's Joseph? He's not somebody that bore someone else, but he is the husband of Mary. And then you have the word again, but now it's passive, from whom Jesus was born or was conceived, the one who is called the Christ. So I just love that Matthew is almost like lulled you to sleep in this long repetition of so and so begot so and so, so and so begot so and so 41 times. And then by verse 16, and Jesus was begotten ex haste from her.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's saying to you, I'm going to tell you a story you've never heard before.
This is a new story.
Yes.
Exciting.
Yes.
Dr. Amy Peeler, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
Glad to be here. I hope those preachers and scholars who are looking forward to Advent and Christmas might have some new encouragement about the power of the incarnation.
What a great conversation today. I hope you agree. Only 168 hours until the next podcast drops, so watch for it. Subscribe to us, rate us today. Come on, you know you want to. If you want to study biblical languages, and of course you do, you need to consider Wheaton College. They have the best program in the country, bar none. Go to wheaton.edu, look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. Thanks to those who make this podcast possible, Ian Rosine, Rebecca Larson, and John Lansma, who is our Wheaton-based director. Thanks to Phil Keggy for our music. Until next time, thanks for listening.